Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scotts Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Just over a century ago, there was an isolated kingdom called Hawaii, an independent nation with a parliament, its own flag, a national anthem, and a beloved queen, Lili'uokalani. But in 1893, she was removed from her throne with the help of the United States Marines. It was a great loss to her people.
If you can imagine something within your own culture that is tremendously important to you, that is suddenly done away with, just totally ripped out and gone. If you can imagine yourself relating to something like that, that's what we went through.
Lili'uokalani was descended from generations of chiefs, revered by the Hawaiians as gods. She had been educated by Americans. A poet and composer, she dined at the White House, was a guest at Buckingham Palace, but nothing had prepared her for the crisis she would face as queen.
Lili'u was well-versed in the Western culture, well-versed in the Hawaiian culture, and knew the values of both sides, and knew the inevitable of what was going to happen to Hawaii.
When Lili'u was born in 1838, the chanting lasted for days. It was the way to herald new arrivals among the ali'i, the high chiefs of the islands. But by this time, many of the old ways had already vanished. The greatest change had been brought by a small group of Congregationalist missionaries from New England who had landed in the islands almost 20 years earlier. It would be their grandchildren who would one day overthrow the queen. By the time Lili'uokalani was born, a third of the Hawaiians were Christian. Nudity was banned, the hula outlawed. The missionaries had developed a written Hawaiian language and taught virtually the entire adult population to read and write. More and more Hawaiians were accepting Western ways.
They were able to just rip out the essence of that which our native soul related to and cast it down and said, now you relate to this, which was the new culture they had brought in. And if the missionaries were like Jesus Christ, it would have worked beautifully, but they were not. They were human beings.
In the harbors, an increasing number of American ships were stopping to refuel on their way to Asia. Hawaiian chiefs could now see that their future lay with the world beyond the islands. They turned to the missionaries for help.
They did a remarkable thing. They created a school only for the children of the 7 families which would be appropriate to rule. And they simply turned their children over to an American missionary couple and allowed them to just take them and train them any way they wished.
Lili'u was one of 16 royal or ali'i children sent by their families to attend the school.
Lili'uokalani at that school was exposed to influences quite other than simply Christian or learning to read and write. I mean, for example, to dress and speak and behave in ways of polite American society, to be strictly regulated by time, self-discipline, thrift, self-denial. I'm not suggesting that all of this was fully accomplished, but they certainly did learn at least the trappings of polite American society very thoroughly there.
She would be called by her Christian name, Lydia. A brilliant student, she learned languages and music and read biographies of English kings and queens. By the time she finished her education, she was easily the most accomplished young woman in the islands.
I think that you cannot underestimate the force that the school had on providing the children with a sense of their own importance, their own role in Hawaiian history. The missionaries had that sense of their importance, and I think they bestowed it upon the ali'i, the children, that they had an obligation and a responsibility to the Hawaiian nation when they would become rulers.
They would rule in a court that emulated the elegance and ceremony of the British monarchy, and even adopted their parliamentary system. But it was from this point on that the Hawaiians began to lose political control.
Once a constitutional form of government was established, then the king had to rely upon foreign advisors to run the government because none of the Hawaiian chiefs had been trained in running a whole constitutional government. And so many of the missionaries assumed roles in the cabinet.
Foreigners became increasingly powerful, not only in the government, but also in the royal family. In 1862, when Lili'u was 24, she married into the American community. Her husband, John Dominus, came from a prominent Boston family.
They were married, but not to, I think, the favor of his mother, who always looked upon her as a non-Caucasian and as someone who she was not going to accept into her house with open arms, despite the fact that she was a princess.
The couple would live in his mother's home, Washington Place, a plantation-style house in the middle of Honolulu. It was not a happy household. Lili'u wanted a family of her own, but was never able to bear children. And she was frequently lonely, her husband preferring to socialize without her. But she would find herself in music. In her memoirs, she wrote, "To compose was as natural to me as to breathe. This gift remains a source of the greatest consolation."
Day in and day out, she would write. It was indeed a place of refuge for her. Most of her inner feelings in the latter part of her life were all recorded through song.
Over time, she would compose 165 pieces and would write one of Hawaii's most famous songs, Aloha Oe.
She would use Western melodies and had the ability to write in the Western style with harmonies and supporting the melodic line. And then she also wrote in the style of the ancient way.
Lili'u became expert in the ancient chants at a time when traditions were being lost. The Hawaiians themselves were disappearing. The ali'i were dying off at an alarming rate. Epidemics and alcoholism, diseases of foreign contact, were taking their toll. Kings were dying young, without heirs. When Westerners had first arrived in the islands in 1778, there were 800,000 Hawaiian people. Only 50 years later, 80% of the population had perished.
As many said, the Hawaiians were dying not only of disease, I think it was Robert Louis Stevenson that commented, they were dying of cultural malaise.
Everything about the Hawaiian way of life seemed to be vanishing. More and more Hawaiians were losing control of their land. The missionaries had pushed through complex reforms they claimed were democratic, but that would ultimately benefit only a small minority.
The common people ended up with less than 1% of the land combined. Soon after that, laws were passed enabling foreigners to own land in Hawaii, and the way was open for them to purchase lands from the chiefs or from the government.
Now, the traditionally large and close-knit Hawaiian families were being scattered. People were forced to seek work in the towns.
So it turned out to be a disaster for the native Hawaiians. But of course it turned out to be a bonanza for the foreigners, and that included the mission children who made good use of these possibilities and became very swiftly quite affluent landowners.
Although she herself was married to a foreigner, Lili'uokalani became increasingly critical of their growing power in the kingdom. But she had yet to realize just how powerful they would become. In 1874, Lili'u's brother, Kalakaua, became king. He named his sister heir to the throne. She was 38 years old. The king was Lili'u's temperamental opposite, extravagant, opportunistic, and always flamboyant. Kalakaua staged some of the greatest celebrations in Hawaiian history. The Royal Hawaiian Band captured the king's spirit in the Kalakaua March.
He had a 2-week birthday party. He had a grand ball, he had a hula program, he had a great luau for 10,000 people. Everything that both cultures could provide were put at the service of this one event.
Kalakaua shared his sister's dedication to Hawaiian tradition. He brought back hula, which had been banned since missionary times.
Oftentimes called the Merry Monarch, I think he's looked upon mostly for his lighter side and his love of music and dance. But His Majesty was intensely nationalistic and intently driven by a need to, I think, preserve the sovereignty of Hawaiian rule in the Hawaiian Kingdom.
At first, Kalakaua allied himself with the landowners. It was natural because he himself owned thousands of acres. In 1876, he traveled to Washington to secure a treaty so that Hawaiians could sell sugar to the United States tax-free. In time, the treaty would prove disastrous in ways Kalakaua could not foresee. But when it first went into effect, Hawaii's economic future seemed secure. Lili'uokalani wrote, "The planters were elated, the merchants were encouraged, sugar companies declared fabulous dividends." As they opened new fields, the planters realized there weren't enough Hawaiians left to cut cane. They brought in thousands of laborers from China and Japan, who in time would outnumber the Hawaiians. The planters imported the latest machinery from America and built railroads to transport the cane. Within a short time, Hawaii became one of the largest sugar producers in the world. By 1885, almost all the plantations were in the hands of foreigners, many of them the grandchildren of the original missionaries. They called themselves the Missionary Boys.
They are a generation who believe that on their shoulders has fallen the responsibility of bringing Hawaii into a state of high civilization as they define it. They, all of them, have, I think, a very deep-seated goal, and that is not only to benefit themselves, but in their view, to benefit the entire nation by Americanizing it as rapidly as possible.
The more money they made, the more they tried to control the internal affairs of the kingdom and the actions of the very king who had laid the groundwork for their fortunes. Soon they would find out that his sister, the Princess Lili'uokalani, would stand in their way. In 1881, Kalakaua went on an extended journey around the world, leaving Lili'uokalani to run the affairs of the kingdom. Soon after he left, ships from Canton arrived in Honolulu, carrying more than 4,000 new Chinese workers. When they docked in the harbor, a captain reported several cases of smallpox aboard ship. Within a month, the disease had assumed epidemic proportions, particularly among the Hawaiians. Lili'uokalani responded immediately.
The princess closed the port. She felt that smallpox, as it had in earlier years, had a devastating effect upon her people. The outpouring of protest by the business community, which was Hawai'i or Caucasian, was tremendous.
The Americans and Europeans, who were far less susceptible to smallpox than the Hawaiians, were livid over this interference.
But she stood her grounds. I think she clearly demonstrated that the welfare of her people was far more important than the profits for the business community.
When Kalakaua returned from his grand tour, he seemed a changed man, more assertive, more self-assured. To the horror of the business community, he purchased a gunboat and declared it the beginning of the Hawaiian Navy. Turning his back on the United States, he moved to cement a relationship with the Japanese, who were gaining interest in the rich China trade. Then, at enormous expense to the kingdom, he built the new Iolani Palace, evoking the splendor he had seen in Europe.
Kalakaua built Iolani Palace strictly to impress. The furniture was purchased from the same factory that was making furniture for the White House. The champagne was all real French champagne. Kalakaua discussed electricity with Thomas Edison himself, and in 1887 installed a fantastically expensive electric light system in the palace. The light system actually ended up costing as much as the whole palace had without it.
Kalakaua's indulgences infuriated the missionary boys, who now held powerful positions in the legislature. Leading the opposition was a young, hot-headed lawyer and journalist named Loren Thurston. He formed a secret society of white businessmen.
My grandfather started the Hawaiian League to try to offset some of the acts that Kalakaua was already beginning to do. Kalakaua had been king for about 13 years by that time, and he was really aching for more absolute power.
The Hawaiian League joined forces with the citizens' militia, the Honolulu Rifles.
He wanted, as did the other members of that group, to do what the colonists had done in 1776, which was to throw off the yoke of monarchy and take on the civil rights and other things of a democracy. And they believed that that was in the best interests of the Hawaiians, and I believe so too.
In 1886, the conflict with the king escalated. The United States, in exchange for renewing the Sugar Treaty, demanded rights to Pearl Harbor as a fueling station for American ships in the Pacific. But King Kalakaua flatly refused to grant the concession.
King Kalakaua became aware that the benefits of this sugar industry was not going to him or the chiefs or to the Hawaiian people, but had gone to the Americans. And he was not about to give up the independence of Hawaii, even if it was over only just Pearl Harbor.
Throughout these struggles, Kalakaua's greatest ally was his sister. In 1887, at the height of the tension, he sent Lili'u and his wife, the Queen, on a trip to London. They would represent Hawaii at the 50-year jubilee of Queen Victoria. It was one of the great social occasions of the century. Lili'uokalani went to dinner on the arm of the future Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and had an audience with Queen Victoria herself. She rode in a procession with the reigning families of the world, exhilarated to be in an environment where royalty was revered. But in Hawaii, the monarchy was under siege.
The Hawaiian League took action one night in July of 1887 and went to Kalakaua with a document that they had drafted, which was a new constitution, which limited his power and forced him at the point of guns to sign this document. And it was a constitution that stuck in the gullet of all Hawaiians, especially the Princess Lili'uokalani.
The king called it the Bayonet Constitution. It turned him into little more than a puppet and deprived most Hawaiians of the vote. Lili'uokalani returned to Honolulu and found Kalakaua distraught. She would write, "We could see on my brother's countenance traces of the terrible strain and anxiety, although this was only the commencement of the troubles for our nation." Kalakaua had no option but to sign the treaty with the United States. American warships now had a permanent port at Pearl Harbor. In her diary, Lili'u wrote, "It should not have been done." In November 1890, defeated and in declining health, Kalakaua sailed for San Francisco to seek medical help. 2 months later, crowds turned out to welcome the king home. But as the ship pulled into the harbor, the yards were crossed and the flags were flying at half-mast. The king was dead. As her brother's coffin was taken ashore, Lili'uokalani was being prepared to assume the throne. She wrote, "Few people have ever been placed in such a trying situation. I was compelled to take the oath to a constitution which had led to my brother's death." On January 29, 1891, at a private ceremony held inside the palace, 52-year-old Lili'uokalani was declared Queen of Hawaii. She inherited the throne at a most critical time for the Hawaiian people. But as heralds went out onto the streets of Honolulu to spread news of her ascendance, the city seemed to be thriving. Sugar money had transformed the capital into a bustling commercial center. There were streetcars, electric lines, telephones, and even tourists.
People coming in were surprised. They thought that Hawaii was a wilderness, a Pacific jungle. And what did they find but this smaller version of San Francisco that was growing very rapidly?
Within a matter of weeks, Lili'uokalani and her entourage left the capital to tour her kingdom. She began a campaign to renew her people's faith in the monarchy, to bolster their hopes that as queen, she would restore all that had been lost during Kalakaua's reign. She traveled to 5 of the 8 islands in the kingdom. There were now only about 40,000 Hawaiians left. They had become a minority in their own land, outnumbered by the immigrants brought in to work the sugar fields.
When Lili'uokalani becomes queen, the expectations of the native population were that she would continue on her brother's legacy. That is, Hawaiians were first, that this is our country, this is our nation.
But Lili'uokalani also had to contend with the sugar planters who took for granted their right to control the throne.
And so their expectations is that she will not be a sovereign, she will be a constitutional monarch, she will be a woman, and therefore go for the advice of her advisors, of her cabinet.
Early on, she was warned by the United States Representative John Stevens not to follow in her brother's path. After years of Kalakaua's lavish spending, the treasury was nearly bankrupt. The queen attempted economic reforms and cut her own salary. Then, 2 months into her reign, a wave of panic spread across Hawaii's plantations. The United States government, in a move to protect domestic growers, in effect revoked Hawaii's favored position on the American sugar market.
This creates a major problem for the Hawaiian sugar growers. They have only one outlet now, one chance to survive. They have got to become part of the United States.
Lauren Thurston formed a new organization with one goal: annexation to the United States. They met in secret and kept no records. Thurston set off for Washington to determine the United States government's position on annexation.
And they told them that they would look favorably on it, but it had to come as a request from the government out here.
In Honolulu, annexation was the last thing Lili'uokalani had in mind. She was secretly making her own plans to do away with the Bayonet Constitution. The Bayonet Constitution was despised by the Hawaiians. It had taken away their right to vote and to hold high political office. Now, they would push their queen to regain political power.
Early in her reign, delegations of Hawaiians began to come to her and ask her to get rid of this terrible document. They came to her in the traditional way, coming to the ali'i for redress of wrong. And there was only one thing she could do. She had to take up this issue.
She had a new constitution drafted and waited for the right moment to announce it to her people. Early in January, the Queen called in the head of the palace guard and revealed her plan. She asked him to prepare for the possibility of violence.
On the morning of January 14th of 1893, the Queen met with her cabinet and informed them that she had all intentions of promulgating a new constitution which would restore herself as monarch with powers of a monarch and reestablish the voting rights of her people.
2 of her ministers, both of American descent, betrayed her. they went to the annexationists with news of her secret plans.
Her idea of a new constitution was to go back to her appointing the upper house, her naming her own cabinet without the legislature approving it, things that simply couldn't be accepted by the business community, and they decided that she had to go.
That afternoon, the Hawaiian community converged on the palace. The new constitution was no longer a secret.
Streams of people, said to be in the thousands, are coming into Iolani Palace grounds for the announcement of the promulgation, that is, the establishment of a new constitution.
Foreign diplomats assembled in the throne room waiting for ceremonies to begin. The Queen was meeting privately with her cabinet. She believed she had their total support.
She asked them to do their duty and sign it. And to her amazement, her cabinet refused to do that.
She wrote, "I told them that I would not have undertaken such a step if they had not encouraged me. They had led me out to the edge of a precipice and were leaving me to take the leap alone." The moment had arrived when the Queen had to face the thousands of Hawaiians who were patiently waiting.
So she went onto the balcony to address this crowd of thousands of people. After all, they had been waiting for this moment. And as she goes on, she talks in Hawaiian. And she says to them, "In a future time, I will promulgate a new constitution. Go home peacefully." Well, in Hawaiian, the word future time can also mean some other day. Could be the next day, could be tomorrow. And the foreign community is aghast, particularly some who have been backing annexation. And they're saying, "See, this is what we have been telling you. This is an act of revolution. This is a treason."
The evening newspapers played up the threat.
And it's fascinating the way they cast her as a revolutionary. I mean, we usually think of them as the revolutionaries, but they were, I think, brilliant in casting her in this new role as the revolutionary against the Constitution.
Her opposition regrouped, this time calling themselves the Committee of Safety, a name that they had taken from the French Revolution. That night, at a private home, the Committee of Safety and other prominent members of the business community plotted to overthrow the Hawaiian monarchy. They drafted papers to establish a new government and chose Judge Sanford Dole, a missionary son, to be their president. They knew they had the support of the United States representative in Hawaii.
John L. Stevens, the American minister, was known for his expansionist views. And there is no question that he was in league with, shared the deepest of nationalistic sentiments with the sugar producers and with Lorne Thurston and all of his friends and relatives.
2 days later, Stevens sent word to an American warship in the harbor to land a company of Marines, ostensibly to protect American lives and property.
He is not cleared to do this by the appropriate channels in Washington. Stevens did this clearly out of his own prejudice, his own deep personal belief that now was the time for the United States government to take Hawaii.
4 boatloads of Marines came ashore. They carried Gatling guns and 14,000 rounds of ammunition and were followed by 2 revolving cannon and a hospital unit. As the Queen watched from the palace balcony, 162 bluejackets marched through the streets of Honolulu. When they reached the palace, they lowered their flags and saluted her with a drum roll.
The idea that a revolution was taking place probably did not occur to most of the people of Honolulu throughout most of these events. When the U.S. Marines landed, the Royal Hawaiian Band was playing a concert at a Hawaiian hotel. It didn't stop the concert. Most people probably saw this as another political disturbance in Honolulu, which would resolve itself as the way it always resolved itself, in a few days.
But by the evening, the United States Marines took up positions facing Iolani Palace and the Queen. The following day, the Committee of Safety proclaimed a new Hawaiian government. Within hours, on behalf of the United States, Stevens recognized the regime. The Queen was ordered to resign.
With the guns pointed at her, she met with her cabinet and had to make a decision. And after great deliberation, she surrendered to the United States of America, not to the provisional government that was established there, but to the United States of America.
Her surrender read, "I, Lili'uokalani, by the grace of God, yield my authority until such time as the government of the United States shall reinstate me as the constitutional sovereign of the Hawaiian Islands."
Lili'u had a great faith in America. It was the Americans that brought Christianity, which she took in and embraced. And because of that faith, she felt that truth and justice would prevail.
The Queen ordered the palace guard be disarmed. The same day, the police department of Honolulu swore allegiance to the new provisional government.
The amazing thing is that as soon as Lili'uokalani was put out of power, she exerted all of her influence to keep the Hawaiian people from rising up to put her back on the throne. She was so terribly afraid of shedding Hawaiian blood in her cause. She leaves this comment in her writings that it's a matter of great pride to her that not a single drop of blood, either of friend or of foe, is upon my soul. But had she allowed blood to be shed, she probably would have survived as queen.
Thurston and his colleagues sailed for Washington. They now had the power to formally request the annexation of Hawaii. It would take 10 days for news of the Queen's overthrow to reach the outside world. On January 18, 1893, the day after she surrendered, Lili'uokalani went for a ride in her carriage. On her way back, she told her driver not to turn into the palace, but instead to take her to her private residence, Washington Place. She firmly believed her exile would be brief, that the United States would recognize the error and she would be reinstated. On February 1st, Minister Stevens ceremonially raised the American flag over the government building. Lili'uokalani wrote in her diary, "Time may wear off the feeling of injury, but my dear flag, the Hawaiian flag, that a strange flag should wave over it. May heaven look down on these missionaries and punish them for their deeds." The palace was renamed the Executive Building. Martial law was declared and would be enforced by the ragtag army of the provisional government.
There was a blackening out of things, of news. But our people were able to find a means of protest. Because they were told by their leader, their queen, not to take up arms, they began wearing hatbands that said aloha aina, that meant patriotism. They began to make quilts that had the Hawaiian flag because the Hawaiian flag had been banned.
In Washington, D.C., where Lauren Thurston had been lobbying for the annexation treaty, everything was changing. A new president was coming into office. In Hawaii, neither the annexationists nor the Queen's followers knew what to expect. One of Grover Cleveland's first moves was to send a special envoy to investigate the situation in the islands. Everyone turned out to greet James H. Blunt. Both sides assumed that he would champion their cause.
There is a lot of hope amongst royalists because it is a different administration. This is now, he's being sent now perhaps to correct, to listen to what is going on. And of course, one of the first things that he does is to lower the American flag.
Blunt wants it clear that the United States government does not view Hawaii as its possession, and that the people of the United States who might be living in Hawaii, while he is doing this investigation at least, are not running that island.
When the Hawaiian flag was raised once again, the Queen sent word to her people to remain quiet and not to cheer, to avoid aggravating the Americans. Blunt, a former Georgia congressman and retired Confederate Army colonel, his wife, and his secretary quickly became part of the social life of Honolulu. They were welcomed everywhere. Hawaiians and Americans were only too eager to bend Blunt's ear with their version of the events that had transpired. Citizens of American descent heard his deep Southern accent and felt free to air their prejudices against the non-white Hawaiians. For 4 months, Blunt took testimony from all sides, documentation that remains to this day the primary historical record of the period. His conclusions were unexpected.
Mr. Blunt writes a 2,000-page report that is one of the greatest condemnations of United States foreign policy by a United States government representative in the annals of American history. Not only did he condemn United States aggressiveness and the conspiracy and the secrecy of it all as illegal and wrong-headed and immoral, but he urged a very pragmatic and moral solution to the problem. Put the Queen back in power.
The provisional government was asked by President Cleveland to resign in favor of the Queen, but they refused, sandbagging the palace in preparation for a showdown. The president was shocked but unwilling to use force against Americans. In a deft political move, he referred the matter to Congress. The Queen wrote, "When the U.S. is ready, she will undo all that her minister has done." Many of Lili'uokalani's supporters did not share her optimism. In the latter part of 1894, Sam Nolan, the former captain of her Royal Guard, began a covert operation to restore the Queen to power. But his actions would only make matters worse. At night, on a beach near Waikiki, Nolan and his men unloaded guns they had shipped in from San Francisco. When the police got wind of the plot, they sent out a search party. A shot was fired, killing the son of a leading annexationist.
Fighting breaks out and the citizen guards are formed. Cannons are brought out and guns barricaded all around the palace. And finally, after several days of searching and searching, they found and brought in all the rebels. And then, most dramatically, the sheriff went to the home of Queen Lili'uokalani and arrested the Queen.
Accused of knowing about the plot, Lili'uokalani was brought to the palace where she would be held to await trial.
The trial itself will take place in the throne room. She is no longer Queen Lili'uokalani. She is Mrs. Lydia Dominus, a common citizen, a traitor, a person who has attempted to bring the law into her own hands as she had done before.
She wrote, "The only charge against me really was that of being a queen. The object was evidently to humiliate me, to make me break down in the presence of the staring crowd. But in this they were disappointed." Lili'uokalani was sentenced to 5 years of hard labor and fined $5,000. Neither was ever imposed. But she would be imprisoned in a small room on the second floor of the palace. Here she was denied all reading material except for her prayer book. During this time, she composed a number of pieces, including the Queen's Prayer. Fearing that she would die a prisoner, Lili'uokalani embroidered a quilt with a record of her life. Lydia Kamakaeha Lili'uokalani ascended the throne January 29, 1891, dethroned January 17, 1893. Imprisoned at Iolani Palace, we began this quilt there. It was during her imprisonment that she would formally abdicate the throne.
Under the threat that 6 of her people will be executed, she signs a document that is not only an abdication for herself, but a statement that the monarchy itself is over, that the kingdom is no more. The news strikes the Hawaiian people with great force because to them she was still queen.
On September 6, 1895, after 8 months' imprisonment, Lili'uokalani was released on parole to Washington Place. It would take another 2 years before her civil rights were fully restored. The provisional government had established the Republic of Hawaii with Sanford Dole as president, but they had still not succeeded in their ultimate goal, annexation to the United States. In 1898, when the Spanish-American War broke out, American troops headed to the Philippines. President McKinley recognized the strategic value of Hawaii and supported a congressional resolution for annexation. On August 12, 1898, in a grand ceremony, President Dole formally yielded the sovereignty and public property of the Hawaiian Islands to the United States. The Stars and Stripes was slowly raised over Iolani Palace, and the Hawaiian flag was brought down for the last time. But few Hawaiians would witness the ceremony. Most spent the day at home, behind closed blinds.
On the actual day of annexation, the Queen shuttered herself at Washington Place, surrounded by her court, by the princes, by her ladies-in-waiting, and they had a solemn picture taken. On the other side at Iolani Palace, there were sharpshooters pointed out. There was still tension in the air that something might happen, but when the Hawaiian flag was lowered, it was said that it was cut into small little 2 to 3 inch ribbons and given out as tokens of remembrance to the sons and daughters of the missionary families, so that they could keep those as little tokens of their great victory over the Hawaiian Kingdom and the end of the tyranny of the Hawaiian monarchy.
Lili'uokalani would live for another 20 years as an American citizen in the United States territory of Hawaii. By the time of her death at the age of 79, she had become the embodiment of the kingdom itself and of its loss. For weeks after her funeral, strange events were recorded in the islands. Volcanoes erupted, and the seas turned an odd hue from the sudden appearance of a multitude of red fish. It was as if the elements recognized that the kingdom was no more.
Major funding for American Experience is provided by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. National corporate funding is provided by Liberty Mutual and the Scots Company. American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
We are PBS.